I've been asked by the coordinators of this afternoon's program to invite you to jot down your questions, and based on the ones I've seen so far, I beg you to be a little bit more brief, or it'll take me an hour to ask the questions. And feel free to circulate or pass those questions back to the booth, and we'll try to organize them in some way after my presentation and broaden the participation here as much as we can, and give you the opportunity to express some of your doubts and concerns about our theme. I'm going to invite you now to explore with me some of the implications of cultural development, which I firmly believe is a catalyst for change. A deeply felt need for change motivated the decision by UNESCO to adopt the decade for cultural development. Expansion in the production of goods and improvement in the material aspects of life have produced unsatisfactory gains in many developing countries. The sacrifice such progress requires in the non-material or cultural aspect of modern life has been recognized and in many cases lamented by those who have achieved the progress defined by traditional economic measures. Consequently, one of the two major objectives of the decade is to place a greater emphasis on the cultural dimension in the development process. Or to put it in a more graphic way, to put a human face on development. What does culture mean in this context? According to UNESCO, and my several references to UNESCO come from a document entitled A Practical Guide to the World Decade for Cultural Development, which was published last year in Paris. According to UNESCO, culture is defined as the behavior patterns, the individual's view of him or herself, of society and of the outside world. It is important here to notice the emphasis placed on the individual. We will return to this critical notion later on. From the outset, a focus on the individual requires recognition that, and I quote, well-being, progress, and happiness cannot be imported in accordance with a pre-established plan and a standard pattern. Henceforward, the individual is no longer considered as a mere agent of progress. He or she must be seen as an integral whole within the society of which he or she is both an active member and its reason for being. Clearly, the decade itself is a response to the conscious rejection of a narrow, materialistic, and superimposed pattern of economic development. Defining culture as behavior patterns based on self, societal, and worldview certainly leaves the definition open. It implies that the individual is free to conceptualize culture independently of any academic exercise. I think that's been very clear throughout this conference. For the purpose of this presentation, let us simply say that culture refers to any and all connections and forms of communication between and among people. This somewhat operational definition will allow us to address suggested actions by individuals and communities later on. Joining culture and development in one title or term makes me very uncomfortable. In light of the origin of the decade, it seems somewhat like an oxymoron. You know, like military intelligence. After all, the sacrifice of culture for development motivated the decade in the first place. Nevertheless, if the individual is kept in the central focus, the mistakes and the short-sightedness of the past can be avoided and need not limit our vision of cultural development. The World Conference on Cultural Policies, held in Mexico City in 1982, gave birth to the idea of the decade for cultural development. The conference proposed a strategy which, quote, implies a series of coordinated actions designed to restore cultural and human values to their central place in economic and technological development. This notion, coupled with the primacy of the individual, clearly suggests that the process of cultural development must begin with the individual and then expand to the larger society. It would thus represent, in its purest form, the widely espoused notion of bottom-up development. Ironically, commitment to this principle implies that no national, regional, or international action is appropriate unless and until the individual responds. How then do we expect the individual to perceive the decade? And what actions should be considered? Can cultural development be a catalyst for changing our assumptions and actions in relation to economic development? More importantly, can cultural development effect positive change in the way people live? Is this an issue only for developing countries, or is there room for cultural development in the quote-unquote advanced and developed societies? Before exploring possible answers to these questions, it might be helpful to further explain the need for cultural development. UNESCO speaks clearly about the need for the decade from the point of view of peoples in developing countries, and I quote, "It is, however, becoming increasingly clear that what constitutes the very basis of cultural life of peoples is threatened. The worldwide influence of a certain number of cultural models, the effects of advertising and the media, the standardization of tastes and lifestyles induced by standardized production methods, the erosion of traditional values and the difficulty in identifying new ones. All these phenomena help to explain the concern of very many societies to preserve, defend, and promote their cultural identities. Rapid changes resulting from external pressures can be very disorienting. Individuals lose sight of their cultural identity, which in turn produces disorientation and despair. In far too many cases, it leads to criminal behavior and substance abuse, not to mention the breakdown of family structure and basic social systems. I'll never forget visiting an aldea outside of Danlí in the southeastern part of Honduras, which borders on Nicaragua and has since become a combat zone. We arrived at a small, modest adobe home without electricity during a teaching trip and were surprised to find a battery-powered television set. It was December, and the commercials included advertisements from a toy store in the capital city of Tegucigalpa, which imported goods from the United States. The children from the aldea were watching commercials for toys that cost more than their fathers made in many months of work. What did those commercials tell those children about how they lived and about their homemade toys? Years later, we spent a couple of Christmases in Nicaragua, and we were struck by the proliferation of aluminum Christmas trees and twinkle lights, but heard wonderful stories about the tradition of building nativity scenes with local materials. The point is not that people had changed the way they celebrated Christmas, but how the change was brought about. What is the proper role of commercial enterprises in the process of cultural adaptation? It's no wonder that in many societies, people want to preserve, defend, and promote their cultural identity. Baha'is the world over promote the concept of unity in diversity. But if present patterns of change continue unabated, achieving that goal of unity may represent a somewhat hollow victory if human cultural diversity has been reduced into universal uniformity. Cultural diversity is truly threatened. For those who value difference, action is absolutely necessary if we hope to halt the uncontrolled and to some degree unintended spread of universal uniformity. The consequences for both the individual and mankind as a whole are vast and complex. It is important to point out, however, that this is not a question of putting up artificial barriers, nor to falling back on the past. Quoting again from a UNESCO document, on the contrary, the objective is to enable all peoples to master the knowledge and know-how of the modern world, to strengthen their own potential for innovation, while at the same time enriching their cultural exchanges with others. The reference to knowledge is crucial here. The preservation of culture does not imply depriving people of knowledge. Baha'u'llah has written, "Arts, crafts, and sciences uplift the world of being and are conducive to its exaltation. Knowledge is as wings to man's life and a ladder for his ascent. Its acquisition is incumbent upon everyone." Notice the emphasis on everyone. Balancing old and new, tradition and knowledge is the standard. The question then is this: how to maintain cultural differences for the benefit of both the individual and the society, while still promoting development in the broadest sense? In order to answer this question, we must first focus on the relationship between culture and science. Culture representing tradition, and science representing new knowledge and progress. UNESCO addresses this issue head-on. It is particularly important, according to UNESCO, to dispense with the idea of culture and science as being opposite ends on the scale, with culture regarded as the vector for humanism, and science as pure technology which imposes its own conditions and thereby poses a serious threat to cultural identity. The complementarity of science and culture in this new framework of developing is not only self-evident, but also a decisive and enriching factor for all and within all societies. Consequently, people everywhere are called to strike a new balance between the factors of change and the demands for continuity, on the basis of the principle of the equal dignity of all cultures. We need not attempt to fossilize cultural remnants for future observation, as if culture could be carefully stuffed, preserved, and displayed behind glass. Instead, choices must be made about what elements of the past should either be discarded or modified and then preserved. No way of life is immune to change. The concept of culture has always included a dynamic understanding of the fluidity of human experience. The development of a global civilization through cultural development requires modification and adaptation. A story I heard recently illustrates this point very clearly. An African man became a Baha'i and attempted to apply the Baha'i teachings on marriage and the equality of men and women. Consequently, he became well known for the way he treated his wife, which, by the way, contrary to custom, was very well. He treated her very well. So well, in fact, that his in-laws insisted that he marry their second daughter, since, after all, polygamy was accepted. He was faced with a horrendous choice: observe custom and break the Baha'i law, or keep with custom and avoid offending his in-laws and avoid the possibility of breaking up the good marriage that he already had. The key question here is not whether or not we can avoid change. The question is, how do we promote conscious choice? If we allow the media or other external pressures to determine the way change is to come about, and thereby shape the nature of an emerging world culture, then there will be no hope for a willful, organized process of change which balances the material and cultural development, science and knowledge. If we agree that development requires a balance between culture and science, and that there is a universal need to foster cultural development to check the forces of uncontrolled change, how is it to be promoted? According to UNESCO, the vectors through which cultural values can be incorporated into development will have to be identified. In this context, the role of the family, educational systems, means of information, cultural action, and more generally, the organizational structures of public life in the transmission of values could be examined in greater depth. In all of the examples just cited, a conscious decision must be made to value, develop, and utilize the full range of cultural expression. I see a parallel here with physical fitness. When the body is no longer a useful instrument in daily work, then one must consciously choose to exercise it. In developing countries where physical exhaustion in the daily struggle for existence is the norm, the idea of a commercial enterprise to allow people to exercise their bodies is a very strange notion. The preoccupation for physical fitness in many Western countries is a clear indication that people must choose to use their bodies in order to maintain a healthful balance between mental and physical health. Similarly, if we allow the electronic media to assume all functions of cultural expression, then social cultural activity can become just as vicarious as for the sports enthusiast who watches the game on TV instead of participating. When the vectors for cultural expression are lost, the values which they embody are also lost. For example, how does a child learn good sportsmanship? By watching TV or playing the game. Another side effect of undirected change is a lessening in the need for cooperation. Less interaction means less cooperation. This is not only conducive to estrangement between social and cultural groups, it is also destructive to relations between generations within a single group. I remember so clearly the example of a Native American woman in a graduate seminar at the University of Arizona. She explained to the class that when attending a mission school as a young girl, a boarding school, she was punished for using her native language. This rule extended to the playground. She remembered having her hand slapped during a game at recess. In her excitement, she momentarily forgot the rule and shouted out excitedly in the wrong language. She went on to explain that her generation did not develop proficiency in their native language, and her parents' generation didn't develop her proficiency in English. As she matured and began to value more and more the culture of her parents, she found herself unable to communicate sufficiently with her elders to truly learn from them. She felt cut off from her own culture, and this truncation can occur in just one generation. Language and culture are inseparable. The relationship between them is a dynamic and synergistic one. I think Dr. Fantini pointed that out very clearly yesterday. Learning a language implies learning a culture, and vice versa. Shared experience, both first-hand and through language, builds lasting bonds between people. Have you ever asked yourself why you feel so close to people in your family that you really don't like? It isn't because you would necessarily choose to have the pleasure of their company so often. Nevertheless, a history of shared experiences creates strong ties and bonds people together. The same is true in many Baha'i communities I've seen. I remember how close my wife and I felt to a particular Persian couple, pioneer couple in Honduras. And I remember in particular a very difficult and eventful teaching trip that we took together in our van one weekend. Near exhaustion late Sunday night, we headed for home, winding through the mountainous roads of central Honduras. And on our way to fight the boredom and to stay awake, the Persian couple taught us to sing a song in Persian about the sacrifices of pioneers. We didn't do too well, but the emotion we shared through that experience and that song created lasting bonds. Choices must be made and acted upon. Values must be preserved and conveyed. Bonds must be created through shared experiences. Once the commitment exists to foster cultural development, what should we look for? How might we conceptualize it and then take action? You notice that's one of my favorite words. An exhaustive answer is far beyond the scope of this presentation. However, we can explore some of the implications of 5 fundamental characteristics of cultural development as I understand it. First of all, cultural development must be originally non-electronic. I say originally because I don't want to suggest a return to some idyllic and primitive past. The electronic media is not the sole culprit. However, unless activity begins with individuals who interact with others on a wide scale, then we will continue to rely on the specialists and the professionals as seen on the screen. Real people must communicate with other flesh and blood people. Returning to the working definition of culture I offered at the beginning, all connections and forms of communication between and among people. Do we truly connect and communicate electronically? I was speaking to a European diplomat recently, and he lamented to me the way the Olympic Games were being covered by the media. He asked me, where is the thrill of competition? Piecemeal reporting to cover everything shows only the high points. It doesn't convey the emotion. Put another way, when was the last time you stood up at the end of a television program and applauded loudly while chills went up and down your back the way they did yesterday afternoon? Non-electronic suggests that it be participatory. This is the second characteristic. Recently I attended a theater production at the National Black Theater in Harlem. I was struck by the level of interaction between the actors and the black audience. At one point in the script, the character starts a long narrative within the play, and at that moment an enthusiastic member of the audience said loudly, "Tell us a story." Emotions running through the audience found verbal expression often. I found myself deeply involved when a character in the play who was an orphan was thinking out loud about her clouded past. When I see people on the street, sometimes I think, are you my mother? Are you my father? She pointed to me and stared me right in the eye, at close range as I was in the front row. Such an intensive moment of interaction is not soon forgotten. After the play, the audience was encouraged to greet the actors. They mentioned to me and others that they enjoyed having us in the audience, as if to say, you were a part of what we did. The memory of an impromptu rhythm band in the Bay Islands of Honduras provides yet another example of the importance of participation. My wife and I were vacationing at a seaside resort. By the way, this was once in 6 years in Honduras. Don't get the wrong idea. And we're taking a walk along the beach after a hard day of snorkeling on the coral reef. And we came upon a group of young boys who had made string and rhythm instruments out of junk and were hard at work perfecting their musical skills. We stood and listened for a long time, and they seemed to enjoy having an audience. Musical groups among the adults on the island were very common, but these boys were not content to listen. They wanted to play their own music. Not long ago, my wife, Pam, was asked to prepare a class for the Northern Arizona Baha'i Summer School. She asked a forest ranger to take all the adults on a nature hike in the national forest which bordered the site of the school. The adults had been asked to collect twigs, leaves, flowers, which they could later use to decorate a copy of a quote or a prayer. It was a big gamble, but she was both surprised and delighted to see how enthusiastic the adults were. Many commented later that usually such activities are reserved only for children. I shared this story with a colleague in Europe recently who then mentioned to me a similar experience. He had attended a conference on the environment in Moscow. After the formal proceedings were finished, they took all of them on a nature hike. Can you see those stodgy bureaucrats puttering around out in the forest, delighted to have an outdoor activity usually reserved for children? How many modes of cultural expression and communication can you participate in? How many things can you do and share with other people? Are you proficient in any of the arts of culture? If you are, when did you last perform for a group of people? How often do you have the chance to enjoy the culture of your own community? This takes us to the third characteristic. Culture development must be community-based. Even though UNESCO has rightly emphasized the role of the individual, unless that individual is incorporated into a community, connections and communications don't happen. A venue is vital. A place, a time, a motive must be provided. In the last quote, emphasis was placed on the organizational structures of public life as vectors of cultural development. This requires adaptation of old structures so that they fit and serve new situations. This requires a conscious choice and a commitment to positive change. I recently read a report about the survival of libraries. Incorporation of videos, games, tools, and other practical additions to books and magazines has ensured the survival of an old form in a new age. I remember the Baha'is of Honduras adapted an old structure when they sponsored a women's conference years ago. Typically, conferences there saw mostly men enjoying formal sessions while the women were preparing food and caring for the children. In response to the call for action on the principle of the equality of men and women, it was decided, by the men I might mention, to experiment with a new kind of conference. Sessions for women were planned, and the men were entirely responsible for food and childcare. And I remember the food wasn't great. But the children survived, and we all shared an enthusiasm and pride for our efforts to break new ground. Willful change enables old structures to reflect new realities. Cultural development is not to be confused with cultural elitism or an appeal to the spread of the fine arts for the benefit of a privileged few. Cultural development is essentially amateur, our fourth characteristic. Please don't take this to mean bad or sloppy. It simply means that the activity is a pastime rather than a profession. That should have been very obvious yesterday afternoon. Look again at the Olympics. Participants must, by definition, be non-professional. Yet we honor them as the best worldwide. The point is this: the models of cultural expression must be open to all. I haven't been on a stage since I was in high school, and even then it must have been an amateur production in the extreme. Yet recently a group of Baha'is in Arizona asked me to participate in a program and act in a skit. No script was provided, believe it or not, and preparations were less than minimal. In spite of all that, I found myself and others who acted with me, if you want to call it that, visibly effecting a large audience that laughed and cheered with great joy. It was a thrilling experience. There is a great pressure in modern societies to rely on experts and professionals for everything. Earlier today, I heard someone praise the organizers of this conference for breaking out of that pattern. Average people aren't supposed to be creative nor innovative. Opening up amateur participation in the full range of cultural expression will open up new creative opportunities for all kinds of people. Finally, cultural development in this age must be eclectic. Few, if any, contemporary societies live in isolation. It is common for communities in Canada and the United States to have not only a mix of cultures from previous waves of migration, but also others who have arrived more recently. Efforts to foster cultural development should include not only the full range of the means of cultural expression and communication, but also reflect the variety and complexity of the cultures themselves, represented in the society of a given community. Add these 5 characteristics: non-electronic, participatory, community-based, amateur, and eclectic to individual initiative and community action, and you get a firm foundation for bottom-up, grassroots, local to national and international action, which will open up limitless opportunities to promote cultural development on an international scale. Such a pyramid, resting solidly on community-based cultural development, has many implications, especially for Baha'i communities. It provides a bridge between generations, socioeconomic strata within a society, between racial and ethnic groups, and between peoples of diverse educational backgrounds. It promotes world citizenship by reinforcing an awareness of cultural universals and first-hand knowledge of the universality of human qualities. It weakens cultural stereotypes by allowing unlike people to connect and communicate directly. We can summarize the characteristics of effective cultural development by listing the requirements for effective projects according to UNESCO. This is quite a list, so get ready. Local base, innovative character, lasting effectiveness, interdisciplinary, research combined with action, integrated approach to development, contribution to international cultural cooperation, multiplier effect, and ultimate independence. It's hard to imagine one project doing all that, but at least the standard is set. Now that we have explored some of the ramifications of cultural development, we can address the matter of implementation, action. The first step is building consciousness within the individual. This in turn leads to creativity and individual initiative. Existing or newly created local social structures connect with the individual and that individual with other individuals and groups, providing motive, medium, venue, and feedback. National information networks and coalitions can connect individuals and communicate on a much wider scale, eventually impacting at the international level. The Baha'i international community, which I have the good fortune to represent at the United Nations in New York, is well prepared to play a role and to add to the catalytic potential of positive change through cultural development. The 19-day feast, celebrated by Baha'is in all organized Baha'i communities, combines all the ingredients necessary for realizing true cultural development. The first portion, sometimes called the devotional period, can include setting prayers to music, dramatic readings of quotes from the sacred writings, graphic depictions of quotes and spiritual principles, The setting for the feast can be enriched by all forms of the visual arts. Traditional costumes can add still another element to the cultural diversity. Prayers can be read in a variety of languages. The second, or administrative portion, can include discussions about formal cultural development projects undertaken by the Baha'i community itself, or in conjunction with other local organizations. Recommendations can be formulated for the local assembly, the local governing council of the Baha'is in that place. Based on local experience, recommendations and offers for involvement on a broader scale can be directed to the National Assembly, the national governing body. In this way, individual and local initiative can be promoted and shared widely. The third, or social portion of the feast, presents an infinite number of opportunities. At this point, involvement in song, dance, oral expression, drama, chants, creating and sharing graphic arts, traditional storytelling are all possible. Refreshments can reflect a wide variety of ethnic foods. New people bring new sources of cultural diversity. Once the members of the community begin to experience such interchanges at feast, other times and places for related activities should then be established. Steps would be taken to plan and prepare future presentations and contributions to not only the 19-day feast, but a host of other events, not just for Baha'is, but for the community in general. As enthusiasm builds, connections are made with other groups and communities for all types of cultural expression and exchange. Hopefully, your imagination can provide a wealth of other ideas and possibilities relevant to your community. As you explore this new panorama, do you feel a sense of excitement? Do you feel a sense of joy? Abdu'l-Baha wrote, "Joy gives us wings. In times of joy, our strength is more vital, our intellect keener, and our understanding less clouded." The question about joy may have sounded strange to you. Most people usually avoid worrying about whether or not they are happy. Life without joy is a logical consequence of the imbalance between the cultural, spiritual side of life and the material aspect, and has become a modern norm. I started by saying that cultural development can be a catalyst for change. We can enable ourselves to foster intentional, constructive, and thoughtful change in the way we live and interact. In a global sense, we are addressing the need to change the nature of change itself. We are exhorting the individual and the organizational structures of public life to change according to a new dimension, so that every member of the human race can truly fulfill the God-given mandate proclaimed by Baha'u'llah to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. Hopefully it is clear by now that the need for cultural development is not limited to the so-called developing countries. Perhaps there is an inverse relationship between the level of material and cultural spiritual development. Great material wealth and power does not necessarily assure happiness. The paradox created by the contradiction between material plenty and cultural want manifests itself in many different ways. I'm reminded of a comedian I heard recently. He was pointing out some of the issues in the current political debate in the United States, including defense spending. And he said, "I don't want the government to spend $300 billion a year defending me from the Russians, the Nicaraguans, and the Iranians. I want protection from the American that tries to mug me on my way home." In closing, I would like to quote from the book, The Secret of Divine Civilization, in which Abdu'l-Baha calls upon all of us to promote development, material, cultural, and spiritual. We must now highly resolve to arise and lay hold of all those instrumentalities that promote the peace and well-being and happiness, the knowledge, culture, and industry, the dignity, value, and station of the entire universe.